The snowstorm nearly swallowed them whole. 3 children, a weary sheriff, and a blind dog struggling down a darkened street. Just when hope seemed lost, a golden light flickered in the distance. It wasn't a mansion or a shelter, but a small cafe owned by Evelyn Moore, a widow with scars of her own. That night, Carter would find not only warmth for his children, but a sealed envelope hidden in his late wife's coat. An envelope holding $80 million, and with it, the power to change their lives forever. The snow had begun its relentless fall over Aspen Ridge, Colorado, by the time the sun dipped beneath the line of black pine trees. It was the kind of winter storm that silenced even the bustling heart of the small mountain town, muffling footsteps, cloaking chimneys in white, and draping every rooftop with a heavy burden of ice. The wind was sharp, like 1,000 invisible needles pricking against the skin, rattling shutters, and whistling through the gaps of old wooden houses. Inside one of those houses, a 2-story farmhouse with fading green shutters and a roof already bending under the snow, the air was just as frigid, though not because of the weather. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing within its walls. Sheriff Carter Wells, 42 years old, stood in the kitchen with his jaw set and his broad shoulders drawn tight beneath his sheriff's coat. Carter was a tall man, once towering and unshakable, but years of service had carved shadows beneath his gray-blue eyes. His dark brown hair, streaked heavily with silver, carried the weary testimony of long nights spent in patrol cars and endless winters spent watching his town. His sheriff's badge glinted faintly in the dim kitchen light, fastened to a thick brown jacket that was now more weathered than polished. Beneath it, he wore a plain navy flannel shirt tucked into faded jeans, a reminder that he was both an officer of law and a father with little else left to him. His boots, scuffed and heavy with mud, planted him like stone on the kitchen floor. Across from him, standing as accusers, were Henry Turner and Martha Turner, his late wife's parents. Henry, a man in his late 60s, carried himself stiffly, as though his very spine were made of rules and judgments. His hair was once a deep chestnut, but had faded almost entirely to white, cut short in a disciplined style that revealed the rigid lines of his character. He wore a collared shirt tucked into slacks, even in the privacy of his own home, his face flushed with irritation, his lips tight and unforgiving. Henry had built his life on pride in his business, pride in his family name, and the loss of his daughter had hardened that pride into something cold. Martha, only a few years younger than her husband, stood beside him. She was tall and lean, her posture sharp, and her expression carved with lines of bitterness. Once she had been graceful, the kind of woman who filled a room with warmth, but grief had drained her of gentleness. Her voice, when it came, was shrill with accusation, cutting through the house with the force of a blade. "You and those children," she spat, her hands trembling as she pointed at Carter, "are nothing but a burden, a bottomless pit we cannot keep feeding. We have no obligation anymore." Carter tightened his grip on the rim of his coffee cup. His knuckles whitened, but his eyes did not falter. He had faced shouting insurgents in Afghanistan, stared down, loaded rifles, and kept his calm when others panicked. But this was heavier because the battlefield was now his home, and the enemy were people who once claimed to be his family. Behind him, the quiet rustle of small feet broke the silence. Liam Wells, 11 years old, peeked through the doorway. Liam was tall for his age, his frame already showing signs of the strong man he would become. But his face carried the premature seriousness of a boy forced to grow too quickly. His hair was dark like his father's, but his eyes were softer, pale blue pools of curiosity and courage. He clenched his jaw tightly as he watched, standing between fear and defiance. Beside him, Emma Wells, only 8, clutched the hand of her younger brother. Emma was a delicate child, with chestnut brown hair that fell in loose curls around her face. Her eyes, wide and green, carried the tenderness of her late mother, and perhaps her fragility too. But beneath that softness was a spark, an instinctive compassion that made her lean into Blaze's side when the storm of words became too much. Holding onto her arm was Caleb Wells, just 5 years old. Caleb's small frame trembled as he pressed his round face against Emma's dress. He had curly, sandy hair that always seemed to fall into his eyes, and a voice full of innocent questions that no one seemed willing to answer. Tonight, his question was the simplest and the most devastating. He turned his gaze up at Henry, his voice breaking through the tension. "Grandpa, you don't like me anymore?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Henry turned his head away, unable to meet his grandson's gaze. The words had struck deeper than any adult's argument could. Standing near the door was the only creature in the room who seemed untouched by the shouting, yet most aware of the storm. Blaze, the German shepherd. Blaze was 6 years old, his once proud body still strong and muscular despite the clouding of his sight. His fur was a rich mix of black and tan, thick enough to shield him from the harshest winters. His eyes, though blind, were hidden beneath a soft white cloth tied securely around his head, a makeshift blindfold that Carter had fashioned to protect him from dust and debris. Blaze no longer barked wildly. Instead, he stood still, his ears pricked, nose twitching as he felt the vibrations of anger in the room. To the children, Blaze was more than a dog. He was a guardian, a silent sentinel who could not see but seemed to sense everything. Emma crouched down, wrapping her arms around Blaze's neck, whispering into his fur. "You're the only one who understands us." Martha's voice cracked the moment like thunder. "You have to leave, Carter, tonight. This is no longer your home." For a moment, Carter said nothing. He let his eyes drift to the framed photograph on the mantel, the picture of his late wife, their daughter, smiling in the golden light of a summer long gone. The memory of her gentle voice echoed faintly. "Take care of them, Carter, no matter what." Finally, Carter's voice emerged, low but steady, carrying the weight of finality. "Pack your things, kids. We're leaving." Liam's hands balled into fists, Caleb's eyes welled with tears, and Emma pressed her face into Blaze's fur. The children moved quickly, gathering what little they had into small bags. The sounds of zippers and hurried footsteps filled the silence left by their grandparents' accusations. Carter gathered their coats, pulling them snug over their small bodies, tugging mittens onto tiny hands. He moved with calm efficiency, though his chest burned with a storm of unspoken pain. He had sworn an oath to protect, to serve, to keep order in his community, but in his own family, he was powerless to stop the rejection. With their bags packed, Carter led his children to the door. Blaze padded ahead, his nose brushing against the wooden frame, his body stiff as though he too knew what was coming. Carter turned once, his eyes locking with Henry's. The old man's face remained rigid, but behind the hardness was a shadow of hesitation. Martha folded her arms, unmoved, her jaw clenched with cold resolve. Carter did not argue further. He reached for the doorknob, opened it, and was met instantly by the piercing cold of the night. Snow whirled into the entryway, swirling around their feet, the icy wind biting at their cheeks. He ushered Liam, Emma, and Caleb forward, the children clutching their small bags as if they carried their whole lives inside them. Blaze followed close, steady and unwavering, his blindfold catching the faint glow of the porch light like a strip of pale fire in the darkness. As the last child stepped across the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them, the echo cutting through the snowy night like a final verdict. The house that once held warmth was now closed to them forever. And so began their journey into the storm, father, children, and the blind dog, who saw more than any of them. Snow still fell in heavy sheets over Aspen Ridge as Carter Wells trudged through the icy streets with his 3 children and Blaze close by his side. The storm had thickened since they had been pushed out of the Turner house. It was late evening now. The windows of the town glowed faintly, and the chimneys of the small wooden shops exhaled trails of smoke that whipped away in the wind. Carter walked steadily, despite the ache in his chest and the sting of the cold. His children were huddled close to him, Liam, tall and silent, carrying the smaller suitcase with stoic resolve. Emma, eyes red from tears, but her arm wrapped firmly around Caleb, and Caleb, clinging to his sister with wide-eyed bewilderment, each breath visible as a puff of white in the freezing air. Blaze padded steadily beside them, his paws leaving deep impressions in the snow. Though blind, the German shepherd's head tilted constantly, ears flicking at every sound, nose twitching to track the movements of his family, his white blindfold catching the dull glow of street lamps like a pale flame in the night. At the corner of Aspen Ridge's small main street, a light shone brighter than the rest. A rustic building with wide glass windows stood against the storm, its golden light spilling out like warmth made visible. Above the door, a simple wooden sign swung in the wind, reading Moore's Cafe. Carter paused, glancing at the children, then at Blaze. He knew they couldn't walk further through the night without shelter. He pushed the door open, a bell chiming softly above his head. Inside, the air was filled with the scent of coffee, cinnamon, and fresh bread. It was a cozy place, small tables spread across a wooden floor, polished by years of use. Lantern-shaped lights hung low, casting gentle amber glows over the room. At the counter stood Evelyn Moore, the owner of the cafe. Evelyn was 38, a woman who carried both grace and quiet resilience. She was of average height, slender, with auburn hair loosely tied at the nape of her neck. Her face was pale but warm, her hazel eyes kind, though marked with faint circles of weariness. She wore a beige woolen sweater under a brown apron, her sleeves rolled up to reveal hands that were always busy, carrying trays, kneading dough, or cleaning counters. Evelyn had been widowed 5 years earlier, her husband killed in a logging accident in the forests near Aspen Ridge. The grief had hollowed her at first, but instead of growing bitter, she turned her sorrow into care for others. The cafe became not just her livelihood, but her refuge, a place where lonely souls found a kind smile and something warm to eat. She greeted everyone in town with respect, from loggers to school teachers, never raising her voice, though her eyes often carried a distant sadness when no one was watching. When Carter entered with his children, her brows rose in surprise. She recognized him. Everyone in town knew Sheriff Carter Wells, but she had never seen him look so worn. His broad shoulders seemed bent by a weight heavier than the storm outside. Her eyes dropped to the children, then to Blaze, the blind dog at their side. The sight of the white cloth tied gently around the shepherd's eyes made her heart tighten. "Sheriff Wells," she said softly, her voice warm but cautious. "What brings you here in this storm?" Carter removed his hat, brushing snow from his shoulders. His voice was quiet, heavy. "We just need somewhere to rest for the night." Evelyn's gaze flickered between the children. Liam met her eyes firmly, protective, trying to appear older than he was. Emma lowered her head, clutching Caleb close. Caleb peeked out, his cheeks flushed from the cold, his lips trembling with unspoken questions. Evelyn's heart broke a little as she looked at them. She hesitated only a moment before moving around the counter. "You'll stay here. I have a room upstairs. It's small, but it's warm. Come." She led them up a narrow staircase to a small attic room with slanted ceilings and a single window that looked out onto the snowy street. Inside were 2 narrow beds and a low dresser. A thick quilt lay folded neatly at the foot of each bed. The air smelled faintly of cedar wood and coffee. "It isn't much," Evelyn said, setting a lantern on the dresser. "But it's safe." "Thank you," Carter replied simply, his voice carrying more gratitude than his words could hold. He set down the suitcase, helped his children remove their coats, and guided Blaze to a spot near the window. The dog lay down instantly, curling into himself, his ears still attentive. Later, when Evelyn brought them bowls of hot stew and bread, Emma sat quietly by Blaze's side. The child's tears slipped silently down her cheeks as she picked at her bread. Blaze, sensing her sorrow, lifted his head and pressed it gently against her leg. Emma sniffled and stroked his thick fur, whispering, "You're the only one who understands, Blaze." The dog let out a soft whine, resting his muzzle across her knees as if to confirm he would carry her grief with her. Evelyn, standing in the doorway, watched this with a soft ache in her chest, remembering her own nights of whispering to shadows after her husband's death. When the children finally settled into sleep, Carter sat alone by the dresser, his sheriff's coat draped across the chair. He reached into the pocket of his late wife's old coat, the one he had refused to discard, and felt something unusual. His fingers brushed against a thick envelope, sealed and cream-colored. He pulled it out slowly, frowning. There was no return address, no markings. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Carter turned it over in his rough hands, his heart beginning to thud against his chest. He hesitated before sliding his thumb under the flap and breaking the seal. Inside were folded documents and a letter. His eyes scanned the first lines, and he froze. The words spoke of a trust fund, assets carefully hidden, and a promise from his late wife's comrade, Ryan, a man who had fought beside him overseas. The figures on the paper nearly made him drop the letter. $80 million. For a long moment, Carter sat motionless, staring at the documents. The storm outside howled against the window, but he no longer heard it. His breath came shallow, disbelieving. His wife had never spoken of this, never hinted at such a fortune. He thought of the children asleep behind him, of Blaze curled protectively by Emma's bed. What was he to do with this? Should he tell anyone? Could he use it without drawing the vultures of greed that always circled in silence? Evelyn, hearing him stir, stepped lightly into the room. Her face was gentle in the lantern light. The lines of weariness softened. "Is everything all right?" she asked quietly. Carter glanced at the envelope, then at her. For the first time since the storm began, doubt clouded his eyes more than grief. "I don't know," he whispered. He slid the papers back into the envelope, laying it carefully on the dresser, as though afraid the truth inside might burn the room to ashes. The wind outside rattled the window panes, but inside the attic, there was a fragile warmth, a moment of safety before the weight of what Carter had discovered would change everything. The storm had eased in Aspen Ridge, leaving behind streets blanketed with clean snow and rooftops glistening in the faint glow of dawn. The town woke slowly, smoke curling from chimneys, the air sharp with the scent of pine and frozen earth. Carter Wells sat at one of the corner tables inside Moore's Cafe, his large hands resting over the sealed envelope that now seemed heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. He had spent hours reading and rereading the documents, his mind struggling to wrap around the vastness of what Ryan had entrusted to him. $80 million was not wealth, it was responsibility, and Carter knew that if he hid it away, it would poison him with guilt. Evelyn Moore, the cafe's owner, moved quietly through the room, pouring coffee into Carter's chipped mug. Her auburn hair was tied in a loose bun, wisps escaping to frame her tired but gentle face. She wore the same beige sweater and brown apron, though the wear in the fabric spoke of long days and little rest. Evelyn had become a quiet anchor for Carter and his children in the few days since they arrived. Her kindness was not loud but steady, the kind that seeped into a person when they least expected it. "You've been staring at that envelope for hours," she said softly, sliding into the chair across from him. Carter lifted his gaze to hers, his gray-blue eyes carrying both fatigue and determination. "It isn't mine," he said. "It was Ryan's. He wanted it to do good, and if I let it sit, it will rot. I have to use it, but not for myself." His voice, though calm, carried the grit of a man carving his path through stone. Evelyn folded her hands, nodding slowly. "Then, give it a name. Give it a purpose." By nightfall, Carter had already begun sketching the idea. He called it Hope for Tomorrow, a foundation that would serve struggling families of police officers and veterans, the kind of families who had been left behind by systems too slow to care. Evelyn became his right hand in the work. She had an eye for numbers, a memory for names, and a heart that connected with people in ways Carter never could. Her soft words eased conversations with lawyers and accountants, while Carter's reputation as sheriff made others listen when he spoke. But while Carter was buried in papers, the children adjusted to life in the small attic room. Liam helped Evelyn with odd jobs around the cafe, learning to chop wood and shovel snow. Emma spent her afternoons sketching in the margins of notebooks Evelyn gave her, drawing Blaze as he dozed near the fire. Caleb, only 5, was restless. He had energy that spilled out in bursts, laughing, tumbling, asking questions that often caught adults off guard. One evening, the storm returned, fierce and biting. The wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling the windows of the cafe. Carter was bent over papers in the attic, Evelyn nearby, when Caleb heard the faint chime of a wind bell outside the window. It was a delicate sound, almost magical in the howling storm. Drawn by it, Caleb tiptoed downstairs, bundled in a scarf that nearly swallowed his small face. He opened the back door, the blast of cold almost knocking him down, and stepped out into the swirling snow. Minutes passed before Emma noticed his absence. She rose from her seat, panic tightening her chest, and hurried to the attic where Carter worked. "Dad," she whispered urgently, "Caleb's gone." Carter's head snapped up, his body tensing instantly. He grabbed his coat, pulling it over his broad shoulders, and reached for his boots. "Blaze!" he called sharply. The German shepherd lifted his head, ears twitching, nose quivering. Though blind, Blaze seemed to understand. He padded to the door, his white blindfold stark against the dim light. Emma followed close, her heart pounding, while Evelyn lit a lantern and handed it to Carter. "Bring him back," she urged, her voice trembling though her eyes stayed steady. The three plunged into the storm. Carter's boots sank deep into snowdrifts, his breath steaming in the icy air. Emma clutched his sleeve, her small body shivering. Blaze moved ahead, guided not by sight but by instinct. His ears pricked at every sound, his nose pulling him through the whirling white. He paused, tilted his head, then pushed forward, veering toward the edge of the trees, where the windbell's faint chime still echoed. There, huddled in the snow, was Caleb. His small figure trembled, his mittened hands clutching the bell's cord. His lips were blue, his eyes wide with fear. Carter dropped to his knees, scooping the boy into his arms, his heart pounding with relief and dread. "Caleb, I've got you," he whispered fiercely, wrapping the child inside his coat. Blaze barked once, sharp and clear, his blindfold glowing faintly as the lantern light caught it. Emma knelt beside him, burying her face into the dog's thick fur. "You found him," she whispered, her voice breaking with gratitude. They carried Caleb back to the cafe, Evelyn rushing to wrap him in blankets and press a warm mug of milk to his lips. The boy's color slowly returned, his eyes fluttering with exhaustion but also relief. Blaze lay beside the child, his muzzle resting on Caleb's leg, as if to assure him he would never wander alone again. News of the night spread quickly through Aspen Ridge. By morning, whispers rippled through the town. The blind dog found the lost boy in the storm. To the townsfolk, it was more than a rescue. It was a miracle. Blaze became a quiet legend, a symbol of loyalty and resilience. Strangers stopped Carter on the street, not to ask about him, but to ask about his dog. Emma beamed with pride, and Caleb clung to Blaze as though the shepherd were his second father. For Carter, the moment struck deeper. He stood at the window that night, watching Blaze sleep at the foot of Emma's bed, the blindfold rising and falling with each steady breath. Carter's thoughts drifted back to the accusations of Henry and Martha, their words branding him a burden. Yet here was Blaze, a creature others might dismiss as useless, who had saved his son without hesitation. Carter's voice was a whisper only the storm could hear. "You and I, Blaze, we're the same. They call us broken, but we're the ones who stand when it matters." The snow continued to fall, but in that small attic above Moore's Cafe, hope had taken root, quiet yet unshakable, destined to grow into something far greater. The weeks that followed Caleb's rescue changed Aspen Ridge in quiet but unmistakable ways. Whispers of the blind German shepherd who had led a father to his lost son spread beyond the town limits. Families stopped by Moore's Cafe, not just for coffee, but to catch a glimpse of Blaze lying by the hearth, his white blindfold a symbol of something greater than sight. For Carter Wells, however, the storm was not over. The envelope, the foundation, the miracle of Blaze, they had given him hope, but the scars left by rejection still throbbed like wounds that refused to close. It was a bitterly cold morning when the past came back to knock on his door. Carter had risen early, his broad frame bent over reports for Hope for Tomorrow, the foundation that was already funding food supplies for widows of fallen officers. Evelyn Moore brewed coffee downstairs, humming faintly, while the children prepared for school in the small attic room. Blaze rested near the window, his head on his paws, ears twitching at every sound outside. The knock came sharp, urgent. Carter descended the narrow stairs, his boots creaking on the worn steps. When he opened the cafe door, his breath caught. Standing in the snow were Henry Turner and Martha Turner, the very people who had slammed a door on him weeks earlier. Henry, once so upright, now seemed bent by unseen weight. His white hair was disheveled, his shoulders sagged beneath a fraying overcoat. The sternness in his jaw had softened into weariness, though his pale blue eyes still held the stubborn pride of a man unaccustomed to begging. Martha stood beside him, her tall frame wrapped in a long wool dress that had lost its luster. She clutched her handbag tightly, her lips pressed thin, as though she had rehearsed words but couldn't release them. Carter's gray-blue eyes hardened, His hand tightened on the doorframe, the cold air rushing past them into the warmth of the cafe. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice steady but edged. Henry shifted uncomfortably. "We need help," he said, the words sounding like broken glass leaving his throat. "The business failed. Debts are piling. The bank is coming for the house." Martha's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "We didn't know where else to go," she whispered. "We thought—" her voice faltered. "We thought you might help." For a long moment, Carter said nothing. Behind him, Evelyn appeared, her apron dusted with flour, her hazel eyes flicking between Carter and the older couple. She had known something of their cruelty from Carter's children, but seeing Henry and Martha now, stripped of dignity, stirred both pity and anger in her. The silence stretched until Liam entered from the stairway. At 11, he had grown sharper in manner, his brown hair falling over eyes that carried more fire than a boy his age should bear. He looked at his grandparents with a mixture of pain and defiance. "You called us burdens," he said, bluntly, his voice shaking yet strong. "You told us to leave. Why come now?" Henry's lips trembled, but before he could speak, Martha snapped, "We made mistakes, but we're still family." The word family cut through Carter like a blade. He had fought to keep that word alive for his children, even as Henry and Martha had turned their backs. He opened his mouth to send them away when Evelyn touched his arm lightly. "Don't decide now," she murmured. "There's a meeting at the town hall this afternoon. Let it be seen." The hall was filled that evening. Men and women of Aspen Ridge gathered, bundled in coats, the wood stove in the corner glowing red. Carter sat at the front beside Evelyn, his children close. Blaze lay at Emma's feet, silent and calm. Henry and Martha stood awkwardly near the entrance, whispers rustling around them. The once proud couple who had judged others now sought mercy in plain view. When Carter stood, his tall frame commanded the room. "They came to me asking for help," he said simply. A murmur rose in the hall, his jaw clenched. "I don't know if I can give it. You all know what they did." The crowd shifted uneasily. Then Liam rose from his seat, his voice clear and piercing. "Dad," he said, looking straight at Carter, "Mom would want us to forgive. She wouldn't want us to carry anger forever." The boy's eyes glistened but did not waver. "If we don't forgive, we'll be like them." The words struck harder than any argument. A ripple went through the hall. Evelyn touched her scarf to her lips, hiding her emotion. Carter stared at his son, his heart breaking and swelling all at once. That night, when the house was still, Carter sat alone by the lantern's glow. The documents for Hope for Tomorrow lay on the table, but his eyes were unfocused. Blaze stirred, patted over, and pressed his head against Carter's hand. The blind dog's touch was steady, grounding. Carter's breath caught. His late wife's final words whispered back to him. "Don't let anyone extinguish the kindness in you." His hand tightened on Blaze's fur. "You're right," he murmured, as if answering both the dog and the memory of his wife. The following morning, Carter faced Henry and Martha in the cafe. The children were there, Evelyn standing quietly near the counter. Carter's voice was low but unshakable. "I'll help you, but hear me well. You will work. You will labor beside the others in hope for tomorrow. You will build. You will sweat. You will stand with those you once looked down on. There will be no pride left in it. If you want my help, you'll earn it." Henry swallowed hard, shame flickering across his worn face. Martha lowered her eyes, her tall figure trembling ever so slightly. For the first time in years, neither argued. Carter's gaze was cold as steel, but beneath it, there was a flicker of compassion. "I will help," he repeated, "but you will stand up on your own feet. No more room for arrogance." The words settled heavy in the cafe, final as a gavel strike. Winter slowly gave way to the muted promise of spring in Aspen Ridge. The snow was still deep along the forest edges, but the air no longer cut as sharply. Birds had returned to the eaves of houses, their songs a cautious reminder of renewal. For Carter Wells, each day felt like another step toward mending something long broken. The foundation, Hope for Tomorrow, had grown steadily, and so had the quiet transformations of Henry and Martha Turner. Henry, who once carried himself with rigid pride, now spent long hours in the workshop of an old carpenter named Walter Briggs. Walter was 70, stooped but steady, with a frame like weathered oak and hands gnarled from decades of chiseling wood. He was a man of few words, his voice low and gravelly, but he carried a patience that Henry had never known. "Measure twice, cut once," Walter reminded him, handing him a saw. Henry's stiff posture, once meant for command, now bent humbly over raw planks of pine. His once spotless shirts were stained with sawdust and resin, his white hair often peppered with shavings. At first, his cuts were uneven, his joints clumsy, but under Walter's gruff guidance, Henry learned. And with each board sanded smooth, he seemed to sand down his pride as well. Martha, meanwhile, found herself in the cafe kitchen with Evelyn Moore and Emma. Cooking had never been her world. She had once dismissed it as trivial work best left to others. But here, with Evelyn's steady presence and Emma's childlike enthusiasm, she discovered something new. Evelyn, auburn-haired and gentle, taught her how to knead bread with calm persistence, her hazel eyes never judging. Emma, only 8, giggled when Martha's dough stuck to her fingers, or when she dropped too much salt. At first, Martha's tall figure loomed awkwardly at the counter, her lips pursed, her movements stiff. But Evelyn's quiet encouragement softened her edges, and Emma's laughter disarmed her. Soon Martha began baking simple loaves, even cookies, something she had never done in her grand house. When she shyly offered a tray of biscuits to the volunteers, the warmth in their thanks unsettled her more than their scorn ever had. Carter observed all this from a distance, his gray-blue eyes cautious but not unkind. He saw his children watching too. Liam stood tall beside his father, his brown hair ruffled by the spring breeze, his eyes holding the maturity of one who had spoken words that changed the course of their lives. Emma grew closer to Martha in the kitchen, a fragile bridge between rejection and reconciliation, and Caleb, still brimming with innocence, often tugged at Henry's sleeve in the workshop, asking endless questions about wood shavings and hammers. Henry, at first uncomfortable, slowly learned to answer with patience. Blaise, the blind German shepherd, became something larger than a dog in the eyes of the town. His presence in the workshops and kitchens, padding steadily despite his blindness, was like a quiet benediction. Children who visited the project would kneel to touch him, marveling at the white cloth tied over his eyes. Volunteers whispered that he was the heart of hope for tomorrow, the one who had already proven that brokenness could still guard, guide, and save. Blaise never barked much. He only lay near the ones who needed him most, resting his head on laps or nudging a trembling hand until it stilled. By early summer, the day of the ribbon cutting came. 10 houses, once abandoned shells, now stood sturdy and painted in fresh colors by the edge of the pine forest. Windows gleamed, chimneys smoked faintly, and small gardens had already begun to bloom. The townsfolk gathered, men and women bundled against the cool breeze, children darting between the trees. A makeshift stage had been built, draped with a simple banner, "Hope for Tomorrow, a New Beginning." Carter stood at the front, tall and steady in his sheriff's coat, his children close beside him. Evelyn, graceful in a pale blue dress beneath her apron, stood nearby. Henry and Martha lingered at the edge of the crowd, their faces drawn with humility. When their names were called to the stage, the air grew still. Henry walked slowly, his steps heavy but resolute. Martha followed, her tall figure trembling as though carrying a weight invisible to all but her. Before Carter could speak, Henry's voice broke the hush. His pale blue eyes shone with tears that had waited decades to fall. "Carter," he said hoarsely, "children, I wronged you. We wronged you." He looked at Liam, at Emma, at Caleb, his lips trembling. "I cast you out when you needed us most. I called you a burden. That is my greatest shame. Today I stand not as a proud man, but as a broken one asking forgiveness." The crowd shifted, emotion rippling through them. Carter's face remained steady, though his eyes glistened. Liam clenched his fists at his sides, his jaw trembling. Emma pressed her face into Evelyn's hand, tears spilling silently. Caleb, wide-eyed, reached for his grandfather's hand. The small gesture undid Henry completely. He collapsed to his knees, sobbing openly. Martha sank beside him, her tall frame folding as she whispered through tears, "Please, Forgive us." A hush fell, then a sound, applause. Not polite, not restrained, but fierce, rising from the townsfolk like a wave. It was the sound of humanity recognizing itself, of reconciliation made visible. Carter stepped forward, placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, and spoke only one line. "There is no room for pride here, only love and work." In that moment, Caleb toddled forward, holding a crown of white flowers Evelyn had woven earlier. He slipped it gently around Blaze's neck. "He sees with his heart," Caleb announced in his small but clear voice. The crowd gasped, many pressing hands to their mouths as tears welled. Blaze sat calmly, muzzle lifted, the white wreath resting against his thick fur like a symbol carved in living form. The applause swelled again, and this time it was joined by weeping, laughter, and voices calling blessings. Evelyn wiped her tears, smiling through them, her hazel eyes full of pride. Emma hugged Blaze tightly, whispering into his fur. Liam stood taller, his eyes no longer burdened with defiance but lit with hope. Carter closed his eyes briefly, feeling the warmth of a future once thought impossible. As the sun dipped behind the pines, painting the sky with hues of gold and crimson, Carter and his children stood together. Blaze lay at Carter's feet, peaceful and watchful, while Evelyn stood close, her presence quiet but sure. Henry and Martha, no longer hardened by pride, held their grandchildren in trembling arms. For the first time in years, there was no disdain, no judgment, only remorse, humility, and love. The town of Aspen Ridge would remember that day not as a ceremony, but as a beginning. A broken family had found its way back to one another. And in the heart of it all was the truth Carter had always carried. What the world calls weakness can be the very strength that saves us. In the end, this story reminds us that the greatest miracles are not always seen with the eyes, but with the heart. Just as Blaze, the blind shepherd, guided Carter's family back to safety, so too does God often work through what the world calls weak to show us his true strength. Forgiveness, humility, and love are not easy choices, but they are the places where heaven touches earth. In our everyday lives, we all face closed doors, harsh words, and moments when we feel cast aside. Yet if we hold on to kindness and let God's light guide us, even the coldest winter can give way to spring. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of faith and hope, and type Amen below as a prayer that God will bless you and your family with peace, forgiveness, and love.